Hi, and welcome back to the New Frontier Playbook. I'm Scott Phillips. We're hitting an exciting milestone. We're going to wrap up one of our tracks, the first track on economics and building a case for space, an economic case for space. And so we're going to walk through and summarize each of the building blocks that we used here in this track to get to a final vision for why an economy, a market economy in space, may make sense and may be worth investing for. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to be jumping through this as we go. Remember, the New Frontier Playbook is a blog at newfrontierplaybook.com, and it's really an attempt to make a political economic case for space. All right. So in our first session, we covered the difference between an astronaut economy and a market economy. An astronaut economy is what we have today. It's for a small number of astronauts. They live up in the International Space Station, may soon be visiting the moon. But they don't pay for anything that they use in space. It's all supplied from Earth. They get paid an earthly wage, and they consume what's available, but they don't have to pay for it as they go. It's very expensive on a per astronaut basis. A market economy would be very different. It wouldn't work for small numbers. It would only work for very large numbers. The kind of large numbers that people like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk are talking about, and others before them too. But in a market economy, prices are charged for everything, and prices have to reflect costs, and wages have to be able to cover the price of living. And so you get an economy that's going to be much more expensive, and wages that are going to be much more expensive too. Uh, and there has to be supply chains to supply everything that's necessary and required. So that gets pretty interesting. And that gets us to the concept we went to economics. Our second episode was a price check. What would a cup of coffee cost in space? And we use that just to illustrate how expensive things could be. A coffee entails supplying the water, the coffee grounds, the water, the milk, flavorings, etc. You have to supply all those things. Either they're coming from Earth at a very high cost because you're lifting them up to a place where there's a large number of people living in space, or you're supplying them from local goods and materials in space that you use to build up and produce a cup of coffee. Either way, however you do it, from Earth or from local resources, that cup of coffee is going to be extraordinarily expensive. It's not your $5 cup of coffee on Earth. It's going to be $250 or $100 or $250 or $1,000. No way to tell just yet, but incredibly expensive. And that makes it really interesting, because that gets us to the concept that we talked about in our third episode, an economic conjugate. It illustrated why an economy in space is going to be exponentially more expensive and higher cost than one on Earth. Because the basic inputs, things like water and air, have to be manufactured, processed, and supplied. And then the costs for that have to be baked into everything. So you have to build supply chains from scratch. You have to build basic resources from scratch. And so you have an exponentially higher cost economy where costs are exponentially higher, therefore prices and wages then have to be 10 to 100 times more expensive than what they are on Earth. Again, that makes it really interesting. We use the conjugate because we termed it an economic conjugate based on verb tenses, a plural tense to the singular tense on Earth. Now, there are conjugates on Earth, and we explored that in episode 4. We used Bangladesh, not to pick on Bangladesh, but we were aware of Bangladesh a little bit, and compared it to Manhattan and the cost difference between these two places. And what we saw just from web searches, Bangladesh has a very low minimum wage for a month, $16 to $250 for a salaried worker. Living costs reflect those wages, or more accurately, the wages reflect the living costs. Manhattan is 20 times to 100 times higher cost and higher wages than that economy in Bangladesh. Both economies can exist on Earth, and so you already have conjugates on Earth. Just because you have an exponentially higher cost of living in one place and an economy that reflects that doesn't mean that you can't have a much different economy in another place. And the same dynamic plays out with space. Manhattan will be that very low-cost economy compared to a future economy, a market economy in space. So that brought us to episode 5, where we think about what does that mean for a minimum wage in space? Well, the implication is pretty obvious that minimum wage is going to be 10x or even 100x what we have on Earth. So $250 an hour is huge, but 2,500 an hour might actually be more reflective of what the cost will actually be in space. We don't really know. No one's really modeled this and thought it through. But these numbers give you a sense, I hope, of what it means for an individual worker in a market economy in space, the kind of thing that people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and others before them are talking about. I tend to think of this as a job that you get a 5-year contract for. You travel up, you come back after 5 years, but when you come back, you probably have $1 million in savings. That's a pretty decent job. I know I would like that. Now, in a macro sense, episode 6 was talking about what that would mean for our economy back on Earth. And it could mean a huge return on investment. All those workers earning those high wages would pay income tax. Any business or entity producing, economic activity would be taxed, and those fees would come back, and the financial flows would be taxed as well. And so you have lots of sources of cash flows coming back from an exponentially higher cost economy, and that could mean something important for Earth. Now, those large income streams then play into episode 7, where we talked about net present value. There are tools for calculating the return investment that comes back. When you make an investment, what are the return cash flows that come back? And is that positive or negative when you use the time value of money, a discount rate, to calculate those cash flows? Now, straightforward concept, harder to do when you're talking about something as big and way out into the future as a market economy in space. But conceptually, the framework is there. There's a lot of uncertainty around the cash flows and the future, and the numbers may not pan out depending on what your assumptions are. But there is a framework for calculating what the return on investment would be back to Earth and whether it makes sense to make that investment. What we really need is an X prize for an economic model. And that brought us to episode 8, which was really talking about NASA 10X. And we offered a really radical premise that it's potentially easier to increase NASA's budget by 10X than 2X. And that's because 2X really reflects the astronaut economy, space exploration, rather limited objectives, even though they're bold adventures to go out into space. They're by a small number of people going to the moon or to Mars. 10X is an investment to make a future market economy in space that pays back money to Earth. It's not just a cost, but it returns a huge investment to Earth. And that's a massive opportunity, a huge opportunity for more science, more engineering, more jobs back on Earth, plus those cash flows. So now think about all those building blocks. Hopefully they make sense to you and they're logical. There's a couple of reaches, and it's not going to happen overnight. But the real strategic economic way of looking at this is to ask the what if question. Now, we talked about Bangladesh and Manhattan. The question would be, what if Bangladesh owned Manhattan today and was able to get all of the taxes off that much higher priced economy, and all the people that were in Manhattan were migrants on 5-year contracts from Bangladesh, and they had the skills, they earned the wages, etc. And Bangladesh got the cash flows back in remittance income and taxes and fees. What would that mean to be able to have the tax base in a very high cost economy to benefit a much lower cost economy? Now, that dynamic is what we're talking about potentially, if this stuff holds together, of owning a market economy in space. And if you're the owner here on Earth, America, and you have that really high priced economy, and you're deriving the public value and income streams coming back, it could be really powerful in terms of economic growth, cash flows, paying down your debt, funding your own public services. That's the prize you're playing for. And that's really the prize of the the case we're making with the New Frontier Playbook, the political economic case for space. And that case for space is this. We're really talking about minimum wage jobs that pay 10x or 100x what they do here on Earth. So $250 an hour could also be $2,500 an hour. We're talking about a market economy in space that's an economic conjugate, at an exponentially higher point in prices and wages. And therefore, we're talking about a massive return on in terms of public investment, ROI. We think that brings you back a trifecta economy on Earth, one with eventually low taxes, no debt, and high public services. It's one where you can afford to address most of the problems, if not all of them, that we face, the transition to a carbon-free economy, the provision of high-quality services, and to do so with the benefit of that economy in space providing the cash flows to do this. And that gets us back to the NASA budget framing once again. It's probably easier to go for 10x than 2x because 2x is a continuation of space exploration. 10x is an investment to build that future market economy in space that derives all of those public returns coming back to Earth, which are, if the numbers pan out, very, very big. So you don't do away with space exploration. These aren't mutually exclusive. You get space exploration within 10x. So they're not mutually exclusive. They're just playing for a much bigger vision. So that's the New Frontier Playbook's economic track. Remember, the New Frontier Playbook is at newfrontierplaybook.com. And it's a political economic plan for space. And we've just covered these 9 episodes, wrapping up with a summary of the economic case for space. So future topics, we're going to talk about public support and what the polls are saying or not saying. Our premise is that we might not be asking the right questions. We're going to talk about culture and media, and is there bias in the media when it comes to talking about a bold future in space? We're going to talk about financing the future in terms of a market economy in space. Is that 10x budget even possible, or are there interesting ways to finance and pay for it? We're going to talk about who are the key interest groups that are out there and who might be interested in supporting this vision. And we're going to talk about how do you build a movement and maybe the role of China. Are they going to give us a Sputnik moment? Is it going to be competition or cooperation? All of that's up for play. So that's the economic case for space, the portion of the New Frontier Playbook. Your support is welcome. Please subscribe and tell your friends. Go out and check out the book itself online at newfrontierplaybook.com. Read, try it, check it out, see, add your name to our email list if you can. Donate, buy the author a beer if you'd like. You don't have to. And if anyone owns Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, we're just pitching for someone to give us a reference and help or get them engaged in the discussion. That's it for this episode and this track, unless we redo it. But that's it for now. Thank you very much for joining us, and more to come as we go. All right, signing off.